Hello and welcome to today's lesson. We're going to be talking about the problems under the Study Island lesson distance, midpoint, and slope in the geometry part of Study Island. And there's going to be three main formulas you're going to need to know. You're going to need to know the slope formula, which is the subtract the y's over subtracting the x's. You're going to need to know the distance formula, which is subtract the x's and square it. Subtract the y's and square that value, and then add them together, then take the square root. And then the midpoint formula, which is add the x's and divide by 2 for your x coordinate, and add the y's and divide by 2 for your y coordinate. So you get two answers for your midpoint. If you need more of a review than that, please check out my geometry playlist and look at the lesson entitled Distance, Midpoint, and Slope so that you can get some more examples and practice problems. So this first problem is asking us to calculate the distance between these two problems. So to calculate the distance, I'm going to be using my distance formula. And it's always a good idea when you're doing these problems to copy down the coordinates and label them xy, xy. And that way, when you are substituting them into the formula, you don't get as confused. So I'm going to label these xy, xy. The x coordinate is always before the y coordinate in an x and y coordinate. And so I just went ahead and copied down the formula once again. And I'm just going to be substituting in my x values where I see an x and my y values where I see a y. So I see this as one big square root, so I can use my calculator and pull up a square root. The square root is in the green here above my finger, so I'm going to have to press second square root to get that to come up. So anything in the green, you have to use the second button for. And so I can see a square root flashing, and underneath that square root is where I'm going to put in my formula, but with the number. So I'm going to have a parenthesis, so I'm going to put in a parenthesis, and then my first x value, which is a 4. And it's always a good idea when you're substituting to put those numbers in parentheses. So I'm going to have parenthesis 4, parenthesis, and then I have minus, and then I have my second x value, which is negative 8. So I'm going to put that negative 8 in parentheses, making sure to use my negative button down here and not my minus button. The calculator doesn't know the difference, so if you use the wrong one, you'll confuse it. And then after my x, I have an n parenthesis, and then a squared, and then a plus, and then a start parentheses. And you notice it's all still underneath that square root because I haven't arrowed out of it. And then I have my first y value, which is 8. So I'm going to put that 8 in parentheses, minus my second y value, which is negative 8. So I'm going to put that negative 8 in parentheses, making sure to use the negative button. Then I have my n parenthesis. Don't forget that last n parenthesis or you're going to get the wrong answer. And then press squared, and then I arrow to the end and press enter, and my answer is 20, which is choice C. So that's how you can use the distance formula on your calculator. And so let's look at one more example. Here I have the points 3, 6, and negative 2, 3 that it wants me to find the distance of. So like I said, it's always a good idea to copy down the distance formula and those points so that you don't get confused. And so I'm going to copy down 3, 6 and negative 2, 3, and I'm going to label them x and y and x and y so that I can keep everything straight. And so then I just look at my formula. So I have this big long square root again, so I'm going to go ahead and bring up my square root, which is second square root because it's in green. And then the first thing in my formula is a parenthesis. So I'll put the parenthesis, and then I have my first x value, which is 3. So I'm going to put that 3 in parentheses, and then minus my second x value, which is negative 2. So I'm going to have a minus parenthesis, negative 2 parenthesis, and then I have that n parenthesis in the formula. So don't forget the formula parentheses on top of your substitution parentheses. That's probably the trickiest part. But if you forget one, then the problem's going to be all wrong. And then you press squared, and then I have plus parenthesis, and then my first y value, which is 6. So I'm going to put that 6 in parentheses and then minus. And then I'm going to put my second y value in parentheses, which is 3. And then I have my end parenthesis in the formula, and then I press squared, and then I press enter, and there's my answer, the square root of 34. So that's going to make A my final answer. This next problem is asking me to find the midpoint. So it says point V is located at the point 4, 1, and point W is located at the point 10, negative 8. And it wants you to find the midpoint of the segment VW. So here is our midpoint formula from before. And like I said, when I'm doing these problems, it's always a good idea to copy down the coordinates so that you can label them XY, XY, and that way you're less likely to make a mistake. So I'm going to go ahead and copy these down, and I'm going to copy down 4, 1, and 10, negative 8. And then my midpoint formula is you add the x's and divide by 2 for the x coordinate, and you add the y's and divide by 2 for the y coordinate. So I'm going to have to do each of these parts separately on the calculator. So I label my points, and my x coordinates are 4 and 10. So I'm going to add those. So I see that this part of the formula looks like a fraction, so I'm going to use my fraction button, which is n over d, and that brings up a fraction. And I'm going to put add 4 plus 10 in the top. And once again, it's always good to use parentheses around those values that you're substituting in. So I put parentheses around the 4, and then I plus, and then I put parentheses around the 10. And then I scroll down and I put that 2 in the denominator. And I press enter. So that means that my x coordinate here is going to be 7. So then I need to do the same thing with my y coordinates. So I'm going to bring up my fraction button again, and that brings up my fraction to fill in on the calculator. I'm going to add my y coordinates in the top. My y coordinates are 1 and negative 8, so I'm going to put that 1 in parentheses, and then add my second y coordinate, which is negative 8, so I'm going to put that negative 8 in parentheses, being sure to use the negative button and not the minus button. Down arrow to the bottom, and put in the 2 that was part of the formula. And then I press enter, and that's negative 7 over 2. But I see in my answers that there are no fractions, it's all decimals. So I'm going to need to convert that fraction to a decimal. And I'm going to do that by using the fraction decimal conversion button on my calculator, which is above the word table in green. So that F arrow D, that means it will convert fractions to decimals or decimals to fractions. So because that was my answer, I don't have to type it in again. I can just press second table to bring up that fraction decimal conversion. And when I do that, I just have to press enter again, and there it is as a decimal, negative 3.5. So that means my answer here is going to be 7, negative 3.5, which is choice C. And then here I'm asked to find the midpoint, and the midpoint of 2 points. So once again, I'm going to copy down those 2 points so I can keep them all straight. And that's going to be negative 1 for my first point, and 9, 1 for my second point, and I'm going to label them XY and XY. And then I'm going to use that midpoint formula to find my X and Y coordinate. And it's going to be just like before, but with different numbers. So I'm going to be using my fraction button. And in that first part of the formula, I add my X values and divide by 2. So I'm going to, my X value here is negative 1, so I'll put a negative 1 in parentheses, added to my second Y value, which is a 9, so I put a 9 in parentheses, scroll down, do a 2 in the bottom, and that was from the formula, and I press enter, and that's part of the formula is 4, so that means 4 is going to be the X coordinate of my midpoint. Then my last problem part of this problem is going to be to calculate the y coordinate using the y plus 2 divide by 2 part of the formula. So I see it's a fraction, so I'm going to press my fraction button, and then I'm going to add my y coordinates, which is -1 plus 1. But I need to put those y values in parentheses. So I'm going to parenthesis -1 parenthesis plus my other y value, which is 1 in parentheses. Scroll down and put the 2 that's in the denominator of the formula and press enter, and that's 0. So that means my y coordinate of my midpoint is going to be 0, and my answer is 4, 0, which is D. So that's all the problems I have to show you on the calculator for this section. I hope that helps you out with some of them. It doesn't show every problem, but it helps you with some of the main ones. Thank you for listening today, and I hope you learned something new.